Ooh, yikes. The Biden administration just published some new rules on chips and China that could devastate the United States chip makers like Nvidia and AMD and have some big implications for even companies like Tesla. Some are calling this the biggest hit to chips and chip trade since the 1990s, maybe even a new tech Cold War. In this video, we're going to talk about what's going on and why, and some potential ramifications for some of the companies that I mentioned. That includes Tesla. So let's go ahead and start by talking about the who, what, and the why. So the Biden administration is instituting these new rules that are similar to the kind of blocks they set up against Russia after Russia invaded Ukraine. And the rule is simple. Any companies around the world, if they use any kind of American tools, machinery, or software to manufacture chips, and those chips meet a certain criteria, which we'll go into the specific criteria a little later, they are not allowed to sell those chips to Chinese companies or Chinese buyers without a specific license. And the goal here is really to limit the growth of China as a military and economic superpower. So this is going to include chips that are used in artificial intelligence. You know, China wants to be the biggest artificial intelligence player by 2030. This is going to hurt that opportunity for them. Supercomputer chips, which could be chips that are also used in nuclear weapons, hypersonic missiles, missile defenses, surveillance systems, any really kind of chips related to all of these things are going to be impacted here. This is a really big move, and things like this have been done before, like what happened to Huawei, which we'll talk about them in just a moment. But this could really impact electric vehicles and certainly even smartphones. I mean, unsurprisingly, that could actually be good for Tesla because if you think about it, chips made by Tesla are used for Tesla and it's an American company, right? Now, there is always this potential risk for Chinese backlash, and then Tesla would be an easy target to lash back against, especially since they kind of hold the Shanghai factory hostage. But in the meantime, you've got the CEO of Xpeng Motors, Chinese electric vehicle company, warning that these United States restrictions will actually push back and delay China's ability to expand their self-driving sector. China's Global Times, which is a paper, it's called Global Times, they called this a, quote, savage attack on free trade, which I thought that was kind of rich given that the Global Times is part of the Chinese propaganda apparatus, and it's part of the state-run media of China, so it's kind of like, really? Part of the Communist Party of China's media is going to suggest that this is an attack on free trade. I mean, it is, but let's be real, it's kind of like the pot calling the kettle black. But anyway, really, this is really interesting. And some folks are saying, hey, but I mean, like, is this like even a big deal? After all, we hear about new restrictions and sanctions getting passed all the time and nothing ends up happening. Well, that's not necessarily true. See, this has happened before. Just look at Huawei more recently, back in 2019, when Donald Trump called Huawei a security threat and banned most tech sales to Huawei in May of 2019. You might remember also that surveillance camera manufacturer Hikvision was also targeted by these. And the argument back then was the belief that the Chinese government would be able to tap into Huawei to spy into the West, especially with any kind of servers or infrastructure or cameras or chips that are actually installed in the West, and then potentially would have access to, turn off those feature or sort of those products, if you will, or other services related to those products in the United States, which could disrupt our United States infrastructure. Think of it as simple as, let's say you've got, 100 computers at an electrical distribution center, but two of your mainframes use Huawei products or whatever, other Chinese manufacturer products. If those are able to just be turned off, that could create a pretty coordinated and disastrous problem to our electrical grid at a time when you could see that sort of attack coordinated with other attacks, right? And so this was at least the Trump administration's security threat argument that let's get Huawei out of here. Other countries like Sweden have since followed in footsteps. Lots of European countries have followed. And so, it really even culminated in the media, like all of this drama, with the daughter of the Huawei founder famously being arrested in Canada in 2018, right, a year before that, at the request of the United States. She was known as the princess of Huawei, and she was arrested for violations or alleged violations of Iranian sanctions with Huawei. And now she's back in China expecting the charges to be dismissed after admitting that, Huawei screwed up, whatever. That story doesn't matter so much. But the point is, the Huawei banned Android apps in the Google Play Store, no YouTube, no Google Maps, really normal conveniences on Huawei phones. And so what you really saw is a collapse of international phone and telecommunications equipment sales China was up 20 or about 15% in 2021 for Huawei Chinese sales, but they had double-digit losses internationally, as much as a 42% decline in smartphone shipments in 2020 versus 2019. And massive reputational damage. So, for anybody to suggest like, whatever, another set of sanctions isn't going to do anything, it was devastating for Huawei. And these things are probably going to be devastating to not only China, but also companies like AMD and Nvidia, unfortunately. See, American tools and software is pretty broad. This means if you're, let's say, Taiwan Semiconductors and you have an American wafer CNC router or a chip etcher, whatever you want to call it, you're banned from using that American machine to make any chips to sell to China. That means you now have to use Chinese tools, which might not be of the quality of American tools. And so since tools are also limited to be sold to China, China's kind of got to make their own. And the chips that are included here are really anything smaller than 14 nanometers in general. Right now, we're working on chips that are going from really 7 nanometers to 5, so 14 encompasses a lot. And it even includes memory chips, anything for DRAM chips below 18 nanometers, NAND chips below or with 28 layers or more, and logic chips under 16 nanometers. I mean, these are some pretty broad implications, and will have impacts to companies like Nvidia, AMD, KLA, Lam Research, Applied Materials, Micron, you name it. And this is all being done under the Foreign Direct Product Rule. And it's happening at a really, really terrible time. I mean, consider the fact that AMD just last week released preliminary results with reduced revenue, a potential slowdown in its integrated chip segment. That's like its server division, which everybody thought would be like immune to a slowdown. Even Amazon's talking about a potential optimization by their customers in server spend. So basically a slowdown in spend. We're seeing a collapse in PC sales. Flat gaming sales, including crypto. So really this broader pain. Samsung's seeing a deeper than feared slowdown with talk about potentially cutting their production by 30%, which kind of makes them sound like OPEC to me. But that's because they just saw a 32% drop in operating profit, and they're like, crap, why are we working so hard to produce more when our revenue's going to crap here? You've also got Micron seeing a 45% drop in revenue and lowering their guidance, yet they still want to produce a $100 billion factory in New York to make more DRAM chips. Memory is a huge part of the industry here. Memory represents 27% of the chip market. It's crazy. And it's only expecting 0.6% growth next year because everything's contracting, right? The prices for memory are already down 15% for DRAM, 28% for NAND flash, just year over year here, which is, well, actually, I'm sorry. This isn't year over year. That's quarter over quarter. That's quite terrible. And we kind of expect prices to continue to fall at least until the fourth quarter of the year, and then maybe flatten out next year. But we're going to talk about some of the impacts here, and they're big, especially if you're into chips. Now, obviously, if you like research and numbers, I always recommend you check out the Programs on Building Your Wealth link down below, because you can join me in those private live streams where you do analysis directly with me, and we do Q&A on companies that are very salient in the market today. So that way we can try to get a first look into what CEOs are thinking or what's going on, and you get lifetime access to that. And they're recorded as well, so you can see those, as well as all of the recorded lectures. Of course, we film the live streams live. But anyway, check that out, linked down below. We do have the coupon code now officially set to expire on Friday. But let's talk impact here. I mean, first of all, you're going to see more protectionism at home for China. After the Trump sanctions on China in 2018 and 19, China's chip industry really focused on growing their own local chip industry. And that actually, by some accounts, exacerbated the supply chain issues that we had over the last couple of years. By June of this summer, 2022, 19 of the 20 fastest growing chip industry firms over the last year came from China. That's compared to just 8 in the year before that. So you've really, encouraged China to grow at home. Now, the problem is they're going through what's probably a deep recession, if not a depression. So that's going to slow their ability to advance, and now not having access to Western tools and machinery and software to make chips, I think, is going to be an issue. But that doesn't mean that AMD and companies like Nvidia are immune. And it kind of makes sense now why Nancy Pelosi sold her Nvidia stake. She kind of rode up the enthusiasm of the $54 billion CHIPS Act getting passed. As soon as it gets passed, she dumps, and it's like, oh, what happens next? Oh, sure enough, you get these new Biden administration rules that affect Nvidia and AMD. Now, why? Why would it affect Nvidia and AMD? Well, it's actually pretty obvious, because if you jump on over into this right here, this is the annual report for AMD. You can see that China, including Hong Kong, makes up about 25% of the revenue for AMD. It's pretty terrible. When you jump over to Nvidia's annual report, you see that China actually makes up more revenue than the United States does at $7.111 billion for the year ending January 30th, 2022, making up about 26% of their total, almost $27 billion in revenue. It's pretty substantial. That's a really big hit. Now, a stock like Nvidia is already down somewhere around 61% this year. So, of course, there's a lot of talk about, oh, now's the time to buy the dip in Nvidia. This is a great company. And it's true, it is a great company. But, I mean, they're very clear that their outlook is entirely affected by potential hits to China, especially with new regulations coming to China. I mean, look, for example, over here. Sales to North American hyperscale and cloud computing customers increased nearly double year over year. But that was offset by lower sales to Chinese hyperscale customers. So they actually only ended up growing 61% year over year and 1% quarter over quarter. So you've got this giant anchor of China. Because, well, they're selling less to China, not only because their economy is sucking, but also probably now because, more so even now, because of these new Biden administration rules. So on one hand, you get these sort of rules that come into effect for national protectionism, for, home security concerns. But on the other hand, it's bad news for Nvidia, it's bad news for AMD. Even if you lost half of that revenue, that would still represent somewhere around 12.5% of the revenue for these companies. So it's definitely a hit. Now, does it justify them being down 61%? Probably not. I mean, the other aspects would be we're going into a recession. We are seeing, computer and PC demand down, server demand potentially rotating down, and we're going into a recession, right? So multiple compression has certainly also taken a hold of a stock like AMD and Nvidia. But yeah, this is a problem. It could actually, ironically, as long as we don't get like a really big backlash from China, could actually be really good for Tesla. Now, I don't really suspect, it certainly wouldn't be my base case to suspect that China would want to lash out against Tesla, because I think that China actually incentivizes Tesla, because not only is Tesla a massive employer, but they want Elon Musk to build more factories in China or expand factories, because China needs the infrastructure. They need the stimulus. They need the manufacturing, right? And China, I think, is very smart in that they realize, look, if we can get 2 or 3 more gigafactories throughout different parts of China, well, we could build real estate around those areas. We could prop up real estate values. We could prop up infrastructure. I do think the Chinese people are smart. And even though, a lot of us in America have negative impressions of their government, I don't think they're as irrational as certainly like a Putin, Kremlin-led government. And so I do think that, and hopefully I'm not saying this from an angle of like just being a fanboy, but I think it would be silly for Tesla to be punished by China, because it would really be punishing one of their large employers, and potentially an employer that could be a larger employer in the future, and a really stabilizing force in sort of China's recovery from this disaster they're going through. That all of that would be at risk if they started doinking with Tesla, because Elon Musk would just immediately say, "Fine, screw you. We'll go build in India instead, or somewhere where we don't have to worry about you using us as political pawns." So I imagine Elon's well aware of that. But wow. Anyway, there you have it. Some crazy new rule here. So more things to pay attention to. All right. Hopefully this was helpful. If it was, consider sharing it. Consider subscribing, and we'll see you in the next one. Thanks. Goodbye.